It is my pleasure to introduce the next Fireside Chat. So this is going to be moderated by my colleague Şafak Yücel. I'm going to introduce him and then he'll introduce our speaker today. So Şafak is the Associate Professor of Operations Management at McDonough School. His research focuses on sustainable operations and especially on renewable energy and sustainable energy and technologies. I know many of you in the audience have already learned from him. He teaches our courses on business of sustainable energy and technology across our programs, as well as he helps with the initiative as the Associate Director for the Business of Sustainability Initiative. I'm very excited about the next conversation, and I'll try not to steal his thunder for why this is especially exciting. But with that, I'll introduce Şafak to join us and bring our esteemed speaker on stage.
Thanks a lot. Kevin, please. So thank you very much. Thanks a lot for being here. In this second session of the day, we are honored, we are very happy to have Kevin Rabinovitch join us from Mars. With more than $50 billion in revenue, Mars is one of the largest privately held companies in the US. We were just in Halloween. Mars happens to be the maker of my favorite treats, M&Ms and Snickers. And Kevin is the Global VP of Sustainability, and he's the Chief Climate Officer for Mars, and his team leads the corporate strategy for the Healthy Planet part of the Sustainable in a Generation plan for Mars. So what makes this conversation particularly interesting on my end, and I can see quite a few of our alums, is Kevin is the protagonist of a case study that we've been using at Georgetown, that I've been personally using in Georgetown for the last 3 years. So a lot of our students will be very familiar with the ideas that we're going to discuss today, including the Sustainable in a Generation plan that we're going to talk about. So we are essentially all starstruck at this point. Kevin, thanks for coming. So in addition to managing a global portfolio of Mars, when it comes to renewable electricity procurement, Kevin also oversees the carbon, water, and land targets and the associated policies in the portfolio of Mars when it comes to sustainable business. All right? So before we begin, please join me welcoming Kevin to Georgetown. All right, so today in the morning, we've already focused on the policy side of the discussion for energy transition, and we've discussed the financing angle a bit as well with Jigar. Maybe it is a good time to shift on the demand side next. And I would like to particularly focus on the companies that procure renewable electricity, and Mars is obviously one of these large companies who procure renewable electricity. And throughout the day, we talked about our perspective on the business case for sustainability. Obviously, there's a moral case, there's an ethical case for following sustainability practices, but we're mostly interested in the business case. So my initial question is, why would a company like Mars like to procure renewable electricity in the first place? Is it to cut costs? Is it to project an image that potentially leads to a price premium for the products that you sell and a revenue generating mechanism? So overall, why are you interested in the first place in order to pursue a renewable electricity procurement strategy?
Yeah, terrific, and thanks for the invitation to be here. Very, very happy to be with you today and address some of these questions. And yeah, we had a bit of this discussion earlier. So we put that case study together back in 2015, 16 with a professor at Harvard, and I actually hadn't heard about it in a long time. And so was quite pleased to discover it's actually being used. And so for anyone that's seen that case study, as I saw some when I did my MBAs and wondered, did somebody just make all this up? At least for that one, there is a real person. It did really happen.
So Kevin does exist. I can see our alums over there.
So Yeah, for Mars, why did we get into the renewable energy game? Actually, we can't really separate the sort of the moral and sort of social and environmental case from the business case, because that is why we're involved in this. So much like Peter and his brother and their family, with a family-owned business, we have a planning horizon that extends literally to generations. As in we've got owners who are thinking about the business they inherited from their parents and that they're eventually going to pass on to their children. And I think that naturally results in longer term risks, opportunities, consequences of decisions sort of working their way up the priority list when it comes to decisions. And so I think that is, I know, that is what's driven sort of the Mars interest in the topic of sustainability more generally, and led to things like the Sustainable Generation Plan and something we call the Mars Compass that maybe I'll talk more about later. So that's kind of what got us going on this. Maybe the other thing that's sort of interesting, and this is true for most businesses, certainly, if you're in, aluminum or really heavy industry, energy is a big deal in your P&L, right? It's a big part of your cost structure. But for the vast majority of businesses, it's single-digit percent, low single-digit percent of your cost structure. So it's something you don't spend a lot of time on. Like we worry a lot more about the price of cocoa and the price of labor and the price of shipping and the price of packaging than we do about the price of energy, just because it's small. And so consequently, it has a history for many businesses of not getting a lot of strategic attention. And while there's an easy answer, which is you do an annual RFP and bid it out, and a bunch of utility companies bid you prices back, you just take the lowest one and move on to more important questions. And so I think one of the things that's happened with sustainability, and in the case of energy, specifically climate, it really brought that up the list of things to pay attention and focus on, which then sort of cracked open this whole maybe there's some other models that we should be thinking about from a procurement point of view. And maybe this shouldn't just be 10% of a relatively junior procurement person's time, but it should be something that somebody more senior is actually spending some time on and really thinking about how do we drive value, where it's not just about the price of what we're buying, but gets into some of these broader topics, like reputation and of course delivering GHG benefits.
Right. And I think these points we've been discussing for quite a while at this point. So the time horizon is an interesting angle. The difference between maybe publicly held versus privately held companies, their approaches to sustainability is another angle that I would like to focus on. Mars Compass would be very interesting for us to learn more about. But before we go into broader sustainability, let me stay with the electricity procurement part a bit further. So obviously, for those of you that are not that familiar with the case essentially discusses the different ways through which Mars can procure renewable electricity. Mars can go ahead and build an on-site generation facility. It can go and purchase unbundled energy certificates that essentially captures the greenness rights associated with the electrons that are produced by a renewable facility somewhere else beyond Mars's facilities. Or Mars can sign these PPAs, right, power purchase agreements, with a developer somewhere else. So let's go into the mechanics a little bit more, because I'm an operations guy at the end of the day, and I'm really interested in the details. So what are the pros and cons of these different approaches of purchasing or procuring renewable electricity for a conglomerate like Mars?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's exactly the exercise that we went through at the start of our work on renewables, which, we've done some on-site projects, which, those are in the sort of tens, maybe, well, it's probably hundreds of kilowatts, so 0.1 megawatts, for non-engineering friends in the room, whereas the Texas project was 200 megawatts. So, on-site we might have 0.2, this off-site was 200, so 1,000 decks. So we'd done some of that smaller stuff on-site. But as we started to think about large scale, we went through that exact sort of like, what are all the options and what are sort of the pros and cons? And, specifically for Mars, there's a lot of things that are appealing about it being on site, right? It's there, you can see it, you know exactly what it is, it's connected to your factory. There's not really going to be much in the way of questions of whether you're really using renewables, which I'll get back to in a second.
I always joke to my students that is the best picture that you can have, right?
Exactly.
A sunset, rolling hills in the background, Mars logo, and solar panels or wind turbines in the horizon. That looks great from a communications perspective for sure, right?
Exactly. The problem is, two problems. One, we didn't pick our factory locations to be good places to put solar panels or wind turbines, right? Because again, it's not an important part of our cost structure. We put them trying to basically spread the difference between where the raw materials come from and where the customers that we're selling to are. And you want to be sort of in the right spot in the middle to minimize transport and labor and other things. So one, they're not necessarily in the right places. Some of them are, but not all of them. But the bigger problem is they're generally not big enough, right? We don't have enough land to produce 100% of the power that we need. And that's even before you get into the, intermittency of there's no sun at night and sometimes the wind doesn't blow. And so you sort of very quickly get to, well, we could do a lot of stuff on site, and we are, and we will continue to do stuff on site, but you're always going to have to go do something else to get to 100%. And then you very quickly sort of go to the logic of like, well, if I have to go off site to do something to get to 100%, that's going to be true whether I go through the trouble of doing something on site or not. And so is it really that important to do stuff on site? Because, if the contract or the project that we negotiated with in Texas, which was 200 megawatts, if it had only been 190 megawatts and we had done the other 10 megawatts by doing 5 projects at site, 190 megawatt contract is no easier or faster than a 200 megawatt contract. Right? It's like infinite economy of scale on the contracting side of things. And so you suddenly go, well, all those resources that I'm going to spend doing all these little site-based renewable projects could instead be doing energy efficiency work at those sites, which has to be done at the sites. And so you sort of get into that kind of calculus of like, okay, going off-site makes a lot of sense because you can aggregate demand from multiple facilities. You can put it in the right place for the right in the sense of the solar panels or the wind turbines. You can put it where the resource is. And you can minimize actual disruption to the facility, right? Because even if the solar panels are in the backyard, at some point you've got to shut the factory down to plug the thing in and then turn it back on, and it's a little more complicated than that. But so there's a lot of things that are compelling about going off-site. Then you get into the question of, well, we could go off-site and keep buying in this sort of short-term spot market annual contract, or we could go to this, at the time, insanely complicated thing called the power purchase agreement. Now it's very much sort of a plain vanilla standard thing that happens all the time. And the insight we had there was, again, probably 2 things. One, unlike, it's a shame Jigger's not here because he would have liked what I'm about to say, but so in a fossil fuel generating asset, coal, natural gas, whatever, there's a capital cost to build the plant that turns fossil fuel into heat, into steam, to make something spin, to make electricity, as Jigger said earlier, right? So there's a capital cost, but most of the cost of producing that electricity is the fuel. Right, over the 50-year life of that asset, most of the cost is the coal or the natural gas. Yes, there's operating costs for salaries and labor, but most of it's the fuel. And basically the way the pricing model works is it just tracks the fuel, right? So natural gas costs go up, electricity costs go up, and everything's being recontracted on an annual basis. So, as the operator of the asset, the power plant, they're not really so bothered about it. It's a little bit like, the gas station that sells you gas to put in your car if you're not driving an EV yet, doesn't really care what the price of oil is, because they're just going to raise your price as the price of oil goes up, or lower your price as the price of oil goes down. And so it's just kind of a pass-through. So that's sort of the historical model. Flip over to renewables, almost the entire cost structure is capital, right? There's almost no operating costs. Yes, there's insurance, and yes, there's some maintenance, more on wind than solar, but it's a tiny fraction of the cost, which basically means the day you turn it on, most of your cost structure is already spent, and then by definition fixed, which means you worry a lot more about those future revenues from selling that power, because if the wind doesn't happen to blow and you make less power, you don't get to sell it for more money, right? There's no connection between your fuel and the price you'll get in the market. Whereas with a fossil asset, those things move up and down together. So that creates a situation where lot more capital up front, which means a lot more risk in the future. It also means your financing costs are a lot more important. So how you're borrowing the money, or maybe you're not borrowing it, wherever you're getting the money to build that thing matters. And that was where we had the insight that our creditworthiness, coupled with the ability and willingness to sign some of these long-term contracts, actually made projects cheaper to build, right? Because the developer would go to their bank and they say, hey, we want to build this wind farm, and the developer would say, great, I'll give you a loan for 60% of the value. I'll give you 60% debt to your 40% equity, and I'm going to charge you 8%. And they'll say, oh, but we forgot to mention, we're negotiating a deal with Mars to be the offtake of the power, and here's the structure that we're talking about. It's fixed price with an escalator or something. And of course, Mars is good for it. They're going to pay their bills. And the bank goes, oh, Mars. All right, never mind. Not 8%, 6.5%, right? And that, made up numbers, right? But in that moment, the power actually gets cheaper to produce, because the debt service that wind farm needs to support is smaller, which means they don't need as much money from us for the power. And so there's a synergy there. And that was sort of the insight where we could leverage our, balance sheet and our or credit rating, or some combination of that, and our willingness to do long-term contracts to actually make projects cheaper. And that was where we again started to get interested in this. But again, back to my earlier comment, that's not an insight that a junior procurement person is going to have, or even think to ask those questions, right? It's just not their job. They don't have the bandwidth to be diving deep and thinking deeply about this. We needed to invest, the human capital in thinking this through first.
I think, so first of all, this is music to my ears, because I have to make this point. Throughout the day, today and yesterday in the workshop, this idea comes up many, many times. Here we have the problem of a high upfront cost, then small but steady savings over time. Then what we need in the case of, for example, wind, is a smart business model, a business model innovation, in this case, creditworthiness of Mars coming in, and easing that initial high upfront cost in order to be able to leverage these steady, long-term savings. And this is the case with wind, this is the case with solar, this is the case with electric vehicles. So over and over again, throughout different contexts, for the business of sustainable energy and technology, we are going to realize the same problem, and the solution is these smart business model innovations that can fix these problems. And PPAs have been one of these factors that unlocked it. Jigar was alluding to solar as a service business model earlier in the day, so that unlocked it for rooftop solar for residential case. So this business model innovation idea is, I think, very important, very key in increasing the adoption and getting the economic case or the business case.
Yeah. Well, and I think thinking through sort of the whole ecosystem of the financial model, because so solar as a service is a great solution for end customers who aren't going to be able to do what Mars can do and sign long-term contracts. But even in solar as a service, somebody still had to pay the upfront cost for the solar panels. That's right. Somebody still took out a loan. There's still debt to service. So you've basically got someone sitting between the project and the people buying solar as a service that has solved that financing problem, right? And so it's an underlying sort of structural difference for renewables, is this capital heavy model, which on the one hand is a problem, on the other hand is an opportunity for innovation and cleverness.
Again, music to my ears. So those that have been in the class, we call this the intermediation business model innovation, right? I mean, in this case, SunEdison and SolarCity and these companies becoming essentially an intermediary between the end users and the financing partners that would monetize these tax equity that we have discussed yesterday as well. But in the interest of time, let me switch the conversation a little bit to your broader role as the Chief Climate Officer at Mars. Obviously, in addition to your leadership role in procurement of renewable electricity, and again, Mars was one of the initial players in this field, essentially helping this PPA business model becoming a reality for developers. I want to switch a bit to your role and your responsibilities when it comes to carbon, land use, water at Mars. Can you tell us a bit more about Mars's overall strategy in these domains, and maybe alluding back to Mars Compass as well?
Yeah. So having gone to the weeds on renewables, let me go back up to the top
Exactly.
and work my way down. So at Mars we have something called the Mars Compass, which is essentially what our owners, the Mars family, have asked the business to deliver. So you can think of it as the shareholder objectives, essentially. And so, maybe not right now because you're in a session, but on a break, Google Mars Compass, and you pull it up and see what it looks like. There's a nice little diagram. So basically, there's 4 quadrants. So the first quadrant, which is in the upper left, so I guess sort of 9 to 12 on the clock, is what every shareholder would always have as an objective of their company, which is strong financial performance. Right, which is basically recent backward-looking financial metrics, right? So how well did you do in the last year? And there's lots of options of how you want to measure that. But so that's sort of one quadrant. Every company would have that. As you sort of work your way around clockwise, the next one we have is what we call quality growth. And quality growth is actually a measure of where our business is selling. Are we selling in categories that are headwind or tailwind, is the way we describe them. So are we generating a lot of sales in shrinking markets with low margins and pressures and regulatory restrictions, and it's off trend with consumers, or are we generating sales in the opposite of all those things? And the reason for that as a metric is that's a great leading indicator for strong financial performance next year or 5 years down the road, right? So it's a sense of like, yeah, this was a great year. Do we have reason to think next year will also be a great year, and the years going forward? And so that becomes another metric as a leading indicator, still all financial. Then we come around to the bottom of the compass, and in the bottom left, I guess, we have what we call trusted partner, which is essentially a reputational metric, which is, the narrative on that one is basically, is everybody glad you're around as a business, or do they put up with you? And you get different answers maybe from customers and suppliers and regulators and the public and young people, and you can survey lots of different niches and get different answers. And the reason for that is it's again a sort of a leading indicator of a headwind, tailwind for your business, right? So if society is basically putting up with you as a necessary evil, that's a setup for someone to make you not necessary. and then, there goes your strong financial performance, and the whole thing breaks down. The final quadrant is the one where I and my team and the rest of the Mars sustainability folks spend all of our time focused, is what we call positive societal impact, which is where we've actually got the sustainability metrics. So we've got GHG, we've got people's lives improved, we've got some packaging metrics in there. And that's because we believe that actually contributes to the trusted partner and to the quality growth. And then our job is to do it in a way that makes it smart to minimize the impact on strong financial performance, or in some cases we can reinforce strong financial performance. Maybe we can get people to be excited about buying our products because they're lower carbon or recycled packaging or whatever. I wish there was more evidence to support that being the case.
Oh, very good.
Someday, perhaps. So yeah, none of the trick-or-treaters that showed up at my house asked about the carbon footprint of the options and the. So, But the idea being that the recipe for sort of, even if you only cared about strong financial performance, we believe the winning recipe for that is to work in all 4 quadrants of these, because the other 3 are what will continue to fuel strong financial performance out into the future. We don't just believe in strong financial performance. There is a desire to, there is a real belief, both amongst our owners and amongst our leadership, that the whole model of, there's externalities that the market doesn't price in, like impacts of climate change or carbon emissions, and hooray, they're externalities, we don't have to pay for them, happy days, let's take advantage of that. That obviously doesn't work. And then you come back to the planning horizon comment, which is, if you're thinking about the business 50 years from now, you can't just write that stuff off and say, well, it doesn't matter, it's someone else's problem. And so, that's all seen as sort of the feedback loop is to drive all of that. So coming down from the compass into the Healthy Planet area, and we have, we're missing the other 2 legs of the Mars sustainability stool, which is thriving people and packaging. So the 3 of us, you can't see the other 2, you can imagine them, are the ones that own thinking through these impact areas for the business, and what should our targets be, and how should we measure them, and how do we engage with the business, and how do we help develop strategies. And certainly in the Healthy Planet area, so climate, water, and land, we've always taken the position that the problems we're trying to solve are fundamentally science problems, right? They're not opinion problems.
Right.
They're not,
right.
They're climate change is a molecules up and down problem, right? Everything else is noise. Some of it useful noise as leading indicators, and some of it helpful. But at the end of the day, the climate's deaf, it's blind. I haven't quite nailed this metaphor yet. It tastes. I don't know what you would say for like, that's, the climate senses molecules up and down, and everything else is not critical to what matters. And so from that, you then build your way out and say, okay, so, how should I do my accounting, and, what are my boundaries, and, how should I set my targets, and everything flows from that. So we did a piece of work with WRI back in 2016, where we the actual title of the paper I think was from doing better to doing enough, and that enough is in reference to what the science says is necessary, which of course evolves over time, and that's really the way we built the program out over time.
Well, I have so many things to comment on, and so many questions.
I have to say, I'm quite pleased that I actually I gave a reference and a citation. I feel very academic right now.
Well, I could talk.
We don't do that in the corporate world, by the way. That's
I could talk a lot about the WRI study. I'm infinitely familiar with that. It then aligns really well with our do well, do good strategy. I am super short on time, but I have to reiterate this idea of the elusiveness of the price premium from the consumer side, because over and over again throughout our courses, our initiative, we repeat this point that you should actually assume that it doesn't exist and try to figure out, still make a business case for sustainability. So this is music to my ears and music to the ears of our students. But I think I would be, and I could ask many, many more questions that I couldn't get through, but thankfully we're going to have a really long working lunch at which I'm sure folks will be happy to connect with you, Kevin, further. Maybe one final question, and that is our favorite question, I think, with Vishal as well. You have a very unique career, and I think your career could give us really good insights, because you spent essentially your entire career at Mars for almost 30 years. You started more on the R&D side, yep. More than a decade there, and transitioned into more business of sustainability related roles. Any pearls of wisdom to our students as they embark on their career journeys when it comes to business of sustainability? And maybe we can end with that note.
Sure, yeah. So arguably Chief Climate Officer is the second coolest job title I've ever had. At one point I was a chocolate engineer, which is, so yeah, I think, what I always encourage people to that are still studying or thinking, maybe earlier in their career is maybe the way to say that, is, there will always be a small number of people that have full-time dedicated sustainability jobs like mine, right? It's going to be a small number. Like, there's never going to be 1 million jobs that look like mine. There may not even be 100,000 jobs that look like mine. But there's going to be tens of thousands of them. So if that's what you want to do, go for it. Lean into it. But recognize you're going for a very, very small niche. What there will be millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of jobs are traditional business roles, marketing manager, finance, operations manager, whatever, where knowing how to do sustainability in that job better than the other candidates is what will get you the job, or will enable you to get promoted or whatever, right? So I think, if you want to be full-time sustainability, go for it. But if not, there's a huge opportunity to differentiate yourself from your peers by being better at sustainability in those other roles. And I think that, opens up a much wider aperture of potentials. The other one I would say is completely what again, echoing sort of Jigger, is the relationships, the networking, right? So, a lot of what happens is, particularly when you're trying to drive these very complicated change agendas, and it's not just doing again what you've been doing for the last, or your business has been doing for the last 20 years, that trust of other partners and other people, that will give you that first 10 minutes before it's obvious that you have a good idea. They'll give you the 10 minutes of time that you can then convince them. So yeah, invest in the networks and the relationships.
And on that note, do we have time for Q&A? Okay, all right, great. Turns out we have more time for Q&A. If you have any questions, you can come to the podium. Maybe we can take a mic, yes, to the mic. Maybe as folks think about their questions, let me ask one final question. So we've talked a bit about this idea of a privately held company versus a public company and their approach to sustainability.
Yeah.
So can you comment on a bit of these differences?
As you might imagine, this is a question we get a lot. And I think most people assume that, as a privately held company, there's sort of more latitude on costs. Like, it's okay to make long-term decisions and make short-term sacrifices. I actually think that's wrong. I think, back to my narrative of the compass, that strong financial performance, that's this year's targets, right? Like, when we're way off plan for the year, we shut down travel in August, and nobody gets on airplanes because that's a way to save cost. Like, we do that stuff too, right? I think the difference is we're tasked with simultaneously solving for short-term performance and long-term performance. So I think, to put it in sort of accounting terms, we effectively have a much lower discount rate on future long-term bad consequences of short-term good decisions. And that lower discount rate causes us to have to sort of simultaneously solve for both. And so I think that's really probably the biggest difference. The other big difference is, and this is a governance thing for our governance wonks in the room. So, the Mars family as the owners are a significant portion of the board. And all the board committees, which means the next time I go talk to the board, which will probably be the 21st, give or take, serious discussion with the board about something to do with sustainability, it's my 21st conversation. It could be the 21st conversation for some of those literal human beings. Like, they could have been there for all of the other 20 conversations, which means you have a much richer engagement with your board as management than would generally happen in a public company. And so, they ask smarter questions. I have to be more on my game. They'll say, hey, 3 years ago, you told me X, now you're telling me Y. What's the story? And I've got to be on it, where that wouldn't happen in most public companies.
Very interesting, very interesting. And maybe one final question, because I think we are already over time. So yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being here. It's very nice to meet you. My name is Andrea. I'm a student at the MS ESM program, and we're currently working, analyzing the cocoa value chain, and we're very curious to know a little bit about, what are Mars' strategies right now that, cocoa is facing some challenges in terms of pricing, and most of it is probably affected by climate change, and how, is the prospects in the future, and how you're, thinking about that.
Yeah. Peter, you want to come join me? He knows more than I do. So back to, energy is not historically a big strategic procurement category for us, although now it's become much more so with climate change. Cocoa is a good example of something that has always been a big deal to Mars and is super strategic to us. So yeah, we've invested a lot of time and money and effort over decades working in the cocoa supply chain. And we've had some successes, but there's still a lot of challenges. There's a lot of structural problems in that supply chain. And it's also quite a unique one in that, 2/3 of the global production comes out of basically 2 countries in West Africa, and 2/3 of global demand comes from sort of 10 companies. And so it's a very concentrated market, which in theory should make things easier. But in practice, there's been a lot of challenges. You're absolutely right. The recent spikes in price are in no small part, the consequence of climate change and not having enough adaptive capacity to that climate change for a lot of these smallholder farmers, leading to lower yields, and then you're into sort of the classic supply-demand price curve. Complicated as always in agricultural commodities, where it's not like a factory where demand goes up, you spin the factory faster. Crops, you get one a year. Cocoa, there's sort of 1.5. There's like a main crop and then a smaller crop. But it's a very slow responding system to change. Which makes it a difficult one to drive change and intervention in.
And maybe one related question, if I may. So we did talk a little bit about this, but maybe if you could give us a bit more of the details of your strategy when it comes to land use, because that's particularly related to the question.
Yeah. So one of the things that is so back to this. Climate, land, water. So our land target, which is actually a bit unique, is to hold the hectare or acre, if you prefer here in the US, land footprint of our business flat over time. So everyone's familiar with net zero targets and GHG emissions. The land target is something a lot of people aren't as familiar with. And the logic behind that is, at the end of the day, what drives, destruction of natural ecosystems and habitat elimination or pressures is an expanding physical footprint of humanity, right? And most of that footprint is agriculture. Yes, we use land for cities and roads and stuff, but most of it is agriculture. And so if we can stop the physical expansion of agriculture, that takes a huge pressure off of natural ecosystems. Now, you still have to do things to make sure that your static footprint isn't sliding sideways into nature and leaving degraded land behind in its wake. But we have policies around deforestation for that. But this hold your footprint flat is really a key idea. But obviously, we still want to grow our business. People still want to buy more of our products. We want them to buy more of our products. And in some cases, that will mean more stuff. So more stuff from the same land means we need to drive productivity and yield improvement.
Efficiency.
Efficiency. And so, that's a big part of the strategy. And again, back to cocoa, the yields that most cocoa farmers, particularly smallholder cocoa farmers, are getting and what is possible, there's a lot of daylight, right? And that's a lot of what the industry has been trying to crack is how do we but encourage and support higher productivity, because one, it helps hold flat or, fingers crossed, even shrink our land footprint. And at the same time, every extra ton, or kilo even, is extra income for the farmer, right? So there's a good synergy between trying to improve incomes and trying to control our land footprint.
Very good, very good. I guess on that note, please join me in thanking Kevin for a very insightful discussion. Thank you so much, Kevin. Thanks a lot.